The catastrophic, blood-soaked failure of the Grand August Offensive fundamentally shattered the absolute last remaining illusions of a swift, glorious Allied military victory on the rugged Gallipoli Peninsula. The immense, highly coordinated effort to violently break out of the suffocating Anzac beachhead and decisively seize the commanding heights of the Sari Bair Range had resulted in absolutely nothing but an unimaginable, staggering loss of human life. The fresh British landings at the Salt Lake Plain of Suvla Bay, originally intended to decisively outflank the fierce Ottoman defenders and break the deadlock, had rapidly descended into a tragic, disorganized farce of paralyzing command indecision and chronically missed tactical opportunities, allowing the brilliant Turkish commander Mustafa Kemal ample time to rush critical reinforcements to the vital peaks. By September 1915, the overarching strategic situation had violently reverted to a deeply agonizing, entirely static trench deadlock, but the psychological atmosphere within the Allied military camps had profoundly and irrevocably darkened. The magnificent men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, who had fought with such breathtaking, almost superhuman courage and ferocity at places like Lone Pine and the Neck, were now completely exhausted, severely depleted in their operational numbers, and deeply, fundamentally disillusioned with the High Command. The relentless, grinding reality of the Mediterranean summer, with its suffocating heat, rampant waterborne dysentery, and unyielding, highly accurate sniper fire, had violently reduced these once magnificent colonial volunteer soldiers to hollow-eyed, emaciated shadows clinging desperately to the jagged, dusty cliffs overlooking the Aegean Sea. In London, the political fallout from the ongoing Dardanelles disaster was swift, bitter, and completely unforgiving. The grand, geopolitical architect of the naval and land campaign, Winston Churchill, was politically marginalized and forced out of the Admiralty, his grand visionary plan now widely viewed by his peers as a reckless, catastrophic military blunder that was violently draining the British Empire of its precious manpower and critical industrial resources. The British War Cabinet, profoundly disturbed by the mounting, horrific daily casualty lists and the complete, undeniable lack of any tangible strategic progress, finally recognized that a drastic, fundamental change in military leadership was absolutely, undeniably necessary. In mid-October 1915, the fiercely optimistic but deeply flawed Supreme Commander, General Sir Ian Hamilton, who had stubbornly and continuously refused to acknowledge the grim, undeniable reality of the strategic stalemate and continually demanded more men for futile frontal assaults, was abruptly dismissed from his command post. He was officially replaced by General Sir Charles Munro, a pragmatic, fiercely analytical, and entirely unsentimental infantry officer who arrived at the Dardanelles with a clear, uncompromising mandate from the War Office in London, objectively assess the overall military situation and determine if the entire campaign could be salvaged or if a retreat was necessary. Upon thoroughly inspecting the fragile, chaotic Anzac frontline positions and observing the overwhelming, dominant tactical advantage held by the deeply entrenched Ottoman artillery overlooking the beaches, Monro's definitive conclusion was immediate, stark, and entirely devoid of romanticized military glory. He explicitly reported that the Allied defensive positions were completely untenable, the frontline troops were dangerously exhausted and prone to disease, and the only logical, strategically sound course of action was a total, immediate, and highly organized military evacuation of the entire Gallipoli Peninsula. However, the unprecedented prospect of executing a massive, full-scale amphibious retreat in the direct face of a highly aggressive, heavily armed enemy was viewed by the British High Command with absolute, paralyzing terror. Traditional military doctrine of the era dictated that a chaotic evacuation under such perilous, exposed conditions could easily result in a catastrophic slaughter on the beaches, with some pessimistic military estimates predicting casualty rates of up to 50% during the complex withdrawal phase. Furthermore, the immense political embarrassment of openly admitting total defeat to the Ottoman Empire, a power the British had historically viewed with patronizing imperial contempt, was considered a devastating, potentially fatal blow to imperial prestige across the entire Muslim world. To definitively settle this agonizing, high-stakes debate, Lord Kitchener, the legendary, physically imposing British Secretary of State for War, personally traveled to the desolate shores of Anzac Cove in November 1915 to see the battlefield with his own eyes. Walking through the narrow, twisting, and terrifyingly exposed frontline trenches, towering physically over the exhausted Australian soldiers, Kitchener finally saw firsthand the impossible, completely vertical geography that maps and sterile reports in London had fundamentally failed to convey. Staring up at the heavily fortified Turkish defensive positions looming ominously just yards away from the Allied trenches, the sheer, undeniable reality of the geographic trap broke the final remnants of imperial stubbornness and military pride. The fateful, historic decision was officially ratified by the War Cabinet. the Allied forces would secretly, and highly precariously, withdraw from the Gallipoli Peninsula, attempting to execute what was widely considered by military experts to be an absolute, unmitigated military impossibility. Before the incredibly complex, highly dangerous logistical machinery of the grand military evacuation could be fully set into motion, the deeply exhausted, malnourished Anzac forces were subjected to a final, utterly devastating trial that possessed absolutely nothing to do with the Ottoman artillery or the deadly Turkish snipers. Throughout the grueling, agonizing 8 months of the military campaign, the primary environmental enemy had been the scorching, oppressive Mediterranean summer sun, the crippling, agonizing lack of fresh drinking water, and the suffocating, disease-carrying swarms of massive corpse flies. The frontline troops were entirely equipped and fundamentally acclimatized exclusively for a blistering summer military campaign, wearing light khaki drill uniforms, thin cotton shirts, and sleeping in shallow, open dugouts scraped directly into the sides of the crumbling, dusty gullies. However, in late November 1915, the volatile, highly unpredictable climate of the Aegean Sea violently and catastrophically shifted, unleashing an unprecedented environmental disaster that would claim thousands of young lives without a single shot being fired by the enemy. The tragic, deadly transition began on November 26, when a massive, terrifyingly sudden torrential thunderstorm struck the entire Gallipoli Peninsula, unleashing a biblical, relentless deluge of freezing rain that instantly transformed the steep, dusty ravines into raging, highly destructive torrents of thick, heavy mud and fast-flowing, freezing water. The sheer volume of water cascading violently down the barren, previously deforested slopes of the Sari Bear mountain range violently flooded the deep, subterranean trench networks located at the bottom of the valleys. The freezing water rose with terrifying, lethal speed. Exhausted men, sleeping heavily in the bottom of deep communication saps or suddenly pinned down by the raging and muddy currents, were violently drowned in the freezing, dark sludge before they could even attempt to scramble up the slippery, rapidly collapsing trench walls. The torrential, unstoppable floods violently unearthed hundreds of shallow, hastily dug graves from the previous months of combat, sending a horrific, ghastly tide of decomposing corpses, shattered bones, and ruined military equipment washing violently down toward the landing beaches. But the sheer horror of the sudden flash flood was merely a prelude to a far more insidious, prolonged, and deadly agony. Almost immediately following the torrential rain, the prevailing wind violently shifted to the north, plunging the ambient temperature drastically and abruptly below the freezing point. The torrential rain rapidly turned into a blinding, suffocating sleet, and then into a massive, relentless 3-day snowstorm, an unprecedented meteorological event that became known grimly among the surviving soldiers as the Great Blizzard. The Gallipoli Peninsula, formerly a baking, sun-drenched, dust-filled hellscape, was violently transformed into a freezing, white, and entirely lethal winter wasteland. The Anzac soldiers, completely devoid of proper winter clothing, heavy waterproof coats, thick woolen gloves, or adequate, insulated winter boots, were entirely defenseless against the paralyzing, sub-zero cold. Men who had miraculously survived the absolute worst of the intense, close-quarters slaughter at the Battle of Lone Pine now found themselves shivering uncontrollably in flooded, freezing frontline trenches, their sodden, mud-caked summer uniforms freezing completely solid to their emaciated, malnourished bodies. The agonizing, insidious, and highly destructive affliction of severe frostbite rapidly swept through the frontline positions like a new plague. Men's feet, constantly submerged in the freezing, icy sludge of the flooded trenches, swelled monstrously, turned a horrifying, necrotic black, and entirely lost all physical sensation, frequently resulting in emergency, agonizing amputations performed by overworked medical officers under highly primitive, entirely unsterile medical conditions on the beaches. The terrifying threat of severe hypothermia became absolute and omnipresent. Hundreds of severely weakened, profoundly exhausted men simply fell asleep in the freezing, snow-filled dugouts and quietly froze to death in the pitch-black darkness, their stiff, entirely frozen bodies discovered by their devastated, shivering comrades the following morning. During this single, catastrophic weather event, the Allied forces stationed on the Gallipoli Peninsula suffered a staggering, incomprehensible 15,000 casualties entirely due to extreme exposure and severe frostbite, a horrific number that violently eclipsed the combat casualties of many major, highly publicized infantry offensives of the war. This horrific, devastating environmental nightmare completely extinguished any lingering, foolish political arguments against the complete withdrawal of the troops. It proved with terrifying, undeniable certainty that the Allied Expeditionary Army would not simply be defeated by the determined Ottoman Empire. If they remained on the exposed, windswept cliffs, they would be completely, physically annihilated by the brutally unforgiving Turkish winter. The monumental, incredibly daunting logistical task of secretly withdrawing tens of thousands of armed men, thousands of pack animals, and massive stockpiles of heavy artillery from the narrow, highly exposed landing beaches of Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay, while situated mere yards from a highly alert, deeply entrenched, and heavily armed enemy, is widely considered by military historians to be one of the greatest, most brilliantly executed tactical masterpieces in the entire history of modern warfare. The incredibly complex, meticulously detailed deception plan was primarily orchestrated by a brilliant, highly meticulous, and profoundly innovative Australian staff officer named Lieutenant Colonel Brudenell White. White fundamentally recognized that absolute, unwavering secrecy and profound psychological manipulation of the enemy were entirely critical to preventing a catastrophic, blood-soaked slaughter on the vulnerable beaches during the retreat. The overarching strategic objective was to fundamentally condition the highly observant Ottoman defenders to fully expect sudden, prolonged periods of absolute, unsettling silence from the Anzac front lines, successfully making them believe the Allied troops were simply conserving limited ammunition reserves or sheltering deeply from the bitter winter weather, rather than actively packing up and retreating. To achieve this psychological conditioning, White implemented strict, highly disciplined silent periods stretching over several consecutive days in late November and early December, during which absolutely no rifle shots were fired, no artillery shells were launched, and the men were strictly ordered to remain entirely out of sight within their subterranean dugouts. Simultaneously, a massive, highly coordinated nighttime logistical operation commenced in absolute secrecy. Under the complete cover of pitch-black darkness, thousands of men and vital pieces of heavy military equipment were silently and systematically smuggled down the steep, winding gullies and efficiently loaded onto waiting transport ships. To successfully maintain the crucial, life-saving illusion of a fully occupied, highly active military camp during the daylight hours, the remaining soldiers were ordered to continuously walk around in highly visible areas, light countless, completely unnecessary cooking campfires, and even lead long trains of pack donkeys carrying completely empty wooden crates up and down the steep hillside paths to simulate the ongoing delivery of critical supplies. The most ingenious, fundamentally brilliant element of this grand, life-saving deception was the rapid invention of the drip rifle, a remarkably simple but highly effective delayed-firing mechanical device conceptualized and built by a highly resourceful Australian private named William Scurry. Scurry ingeniously rigged two empty metal ration tins, placing one directly above the other. The top tin was filled with water, which slowly and steadily dripped through a tiny, carefully pierced puncture hole into the bottom tin. The bottom tin was carefully attached by a taut piece of string to the heavy metal trigger of a loaded, securely mounted Lee-Enfield rifle aimed at the Turkish lines. Once the bottom tin became sufficiently heavy with the accumulated, dripping water, it would suddenly drop due to gravity, forcefully pulling the string and firing the rifle. By carefully adjusting the water flow rate, these ingenious ghost guns could be precisely timed to fire at irregular, highly unpredictable intervals long after the absolute last Australian soldier had quietly abandoned the frontline trench. The final, incredibly tense phase of the massive military evacuation occurred over the pitch-black, freezing nights of December the 18th and 19th, 1915. The last, highly vulnerable rearguard troops, often those who had been the very first to land on that fateful April morning, began their solemn, agonizingly quiet descent to the waiting wooden boats. To ensure absolute, uninterrupted silence during the withdrawal, the men wrapped thick burlap sacks and torn wool blankets tightly around their heavy leather boots to completely muffle the loud crunching sound of their footsteps on the gravel hillside paths. The trench floors were thickly lined with ripped blankets to deaden any sound, and strict military orders were communicated strictly through quiet, tense whispers. It was a profoundly emotional, deeply haunting departure for the surviving veterans. Many soldiers, entirely overwhelmed by the tragic, heartbreaking reality of abandoning the thousands of fallen comrades permanently buried in the shallow, rocky graves of the Gallipoli hillside, paused in the freezing darkness to quietly tidy the small wooden crosses or respectfully leave brief, handwritten notes and unopened tins of scarce food for Johnny Turk, the fierce enemy they had grown to deeply respect through mutual suffering. As the final, small wooden rowboats silently pulled away from the dark, entirely deserted shores of Anzac Cove in the early, pre-dawn hours of December 20th, the rigged drip rifles continued to sporadically echo across the empty, silent ravines, completely fooling the Ottoman sentries. When the Turkish forces finally, cautiously advanced into the Anzac lines the following morning, expecting a fierce battle, they found the entire, sprawling labyrinth of mud and timber completely, eerily deserted. The absolute military impossible had been brilliantly achieved. The Anzacs had successfully evacuated tens of thousands of men from a deadly trap without suffering a single, solitary casualty. Though the overall Gallipoli military campaign was an absolute, tragic strategic disaster that cost the Allies over 140,000 casualties, the immaculate military discipline, sheer physical endurance, and absolute, unbreakable camaraderie demonstrated during the hellish 8 months and the brilliant, silent retreat forged a profound, enduring national identity, forever cementing the immortal, highly revered cultural legend of the Anzac.